Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me introduce you to our speaker. I think he is well known to a lot of you guys, but he was so kind to send a CV, which is very interesting. So Paul was born in Wiltshire, England, and he immigrated with his parents and two of his elder brothers to Kenya in 1948, where he was brought up and did all his schooling. During 1961, his grandmother and his sister came to stay with them. And while they were talking to each other, he started to become interested in family history and started with his first family tree. That's a long time ago, Paul, 1961. Okay. In December 1963, his parents, his sister, and himself moved overseas again, or went to different countries. And they came to Escort in Natal, where his father set up a Volkswagen dealership. He met his wife in Escort while playing hockey for the town team. And at some stage in their courtship in the late 1960s, his grandfather mentioned that she was a descendant of the 1820 settlers, Miles Bowker. A family history chat started later, and so he started to build his first tree on the 1820 settlers. There were a few other 1820 settlers descendants in Escort, the Tars, the Dixes, the Sturleys, the Hooley, the Elliots, and he began to find out where the people were fitting in the 1820 settlers. By the time him and his wife moved back to England in 2001, the two sons were already living there and working in London. He accumulated a lot of information and books on the settlers. And he started to computerize all the information. And that is how the website 1820settlers.com started. And that was in December 2003. And this year, it is the 20th anniversary. Well done, Paul. His objective was to find out the genealogies of all the original settlers and their descendants. And now the web accounts for 2,930 and more, possibly 3,800 original settlers. And he's been sent new information all the time. Paul retired 10 years ago, and he's currently trying to track down his own family, mainly the English ancestry. And he does a lot of voluntary work via Zoom, assisting newcomers to use the genealogy packages that he uses.
Okay, as you know, I was born here in England. I moved around a bit in South Africa from Escort, from being in the motor business, then joined Nestle. They transferred me to Randburg, and we spent 10 years in Randburg. And I left them and joined NCR and in Johannesburg. And they shipped me back to Westville in 1988. So I have had excursions outside of Natal, but there's quite a lot of places I never got to when we were there. I think you know that I married my Mrs. Janet in Escort. Just going through my first bit of background here. Okay, this presentation on the 1820 settlers to South Africa, I've done quite a few times to genealogy groups here in England, where they know very little about South Africa or who the 1820 settlers were, which is terrible in many ways. And I think Sue will agree. We go to these presentations and say, oh, we know about 1820 settlers, and they look at you with a blank face. So this presentation, I'm going to limit to the formation and the arrival of the 1820 settlers to South Africa and the reasons behind it. I was asked earlier by somebody in the week, which settler am I going to talk about? Well, if I was to talk about 2,900 of them, it'll take all week or even more. Anyway, so here we go, a little bit of a history lesson. Roughly going to cover what happened in the early days to get up to the 1820 settlers coming through. And I think the easiest way for this is the short history lesson. On a business trip to the USA in the 1980s, a young waitress asked where we were from. I think there were 6 of us over there with NCR training. And having said South Africa to her, she said, "Oh, that's next to Egypt, isn't it?" She was only about 6,000 miles out. So we'll go through a little bit of these topics, and I hope I don't bore you. In 1847, Bartholomew Diaz was the first acknowledged sailor to discover and round the Cape of Good Hope. He got as far as the mouth of what is now known as the Great Fish River, and we will see that this river also became a boundary line about 330 years later. He returned back at that point to return to Portugal. On the 12th of March, 1488, he erected his first padreo, or stone cross, at Kwaihoek, near the mouth of the Bushman's River in the Eastern Cape Coast. It's a little bit further north up the coast from Port Elizabeth. Don't ask me to pronounce its new name. It's all Port Elizabeth to me. It's South Africa's oldest monument, and I believe it's recently been trashed again. These seem to happen everywhere, even here in England. On subsequent trips, Vasco da Gama, another Portuguese, he used the knowledge he got from Diaz's trip to navigate to Cape and then further up to East Africa and Calcutta and Goa in India. There have been overland routes established to Asia a few hundred years before, but the cartage of the spices, etc., overland took a very long time because they had to cross couple of deserts to start getting anywhere near Europe. The Portuguese, Spanish, French, and Dutch were all trying to find sea routes to the East Indies. Of interest, when I lived in Kenya, we used to go to Mombasa and Malindi on holiday. That's, I don't know if I can get this to work. Not that. That one. Mombasa, Malindi on the east coast here. Kenya is all around there. And at Mombasa, there's a fort there called Fort Jesus, which was built by the Portuguese as a defense against the marauding pirate ships that used to come down from Arabia. And further north towards Malindi, there's an old town there called Gedi Ruins, which was a fishing village in about the 1600s. So there was life in Africa at the time. This picture gives an idea of the routes that the sailing ships took on the outward journey using the trade winds. So when they left to go out, they came down this route here. The winds going in the circle here kept them that way. It was easy then to cross and then up either through there or straight out and up to India and so on that way. On the way back, they found it was easier to come up around the Horn of Africa to get back to Holland. It used to take about 3 to 4 months from Lisbon to the Cape on that route. So they had to stop in a couple of places, normally Canary Islands, was the other one, Santiago, Cape Verde Islands, and sometimes you'll see one of the ships stopped right in the middle here for extra food and provisions before getting through to South Africa. Anyone remember the Cape to Rio yacht races in the 70s? They used to leave Cape Town, and we all wondered, why did they sail up this way first before going over and down to Cape? Surely it's quicker to go straight across. Well, they actually went up and caught the trade winds, which took them around and then down to Rio. Going across here, they've been trying to sail against a headwind the whole time. So it makes a lot of sense that they actually use the weather and the weather patterns to get around the world. In April 1595, 4 ships from Holland left Amsterdam and Hoorn in the north of Holland, up through that inland lake called the Zuiderzee, down the English Channel and out on the established routes to India and Indonesia. They were away for nearly 2.5 years, And on that trip, they lost 75% of their men, and I think 2 or 3 of the ships got lost as well. I think only 2 or 1 got back. I can't remember the exact numbers there. They were successful, and they managed to persuade the Dutch government to assist with the setup of a trading company. And that was the start of the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. It was founded with a monopoly amongst the Dutch for trade to the East. And as England and France couldn't really compete at that time, they were a little bit jealous of the VOC. It was very successful in the early days, and they ran for pretty much 200 years through to 1799, when they got sorted out in the wars. Of interest, in August 2004, as part of my job here with Specsavers, I went over to Hoorn in the Netherlands to install a new Specsavers store. And if I remember correctly, the building on the left, this one, which is now a museum, that was the offices of the VOC, and they've got their VOC badges and emblems up on it. And this guy standing on the statue here, I can't remember who he was one of the famous sea captains of the time. Hoorn is a very pretty old town and harbour. Looking at the shape of the buildings, you wonder if the Dutch ever knew anything about plumb lines and getting things straight, because all the buildings are at different angles. But it all goes down to how they actually were charged. They paid rent on the frontage on the street. So a small little house like this one would pay half the price of that one. So they paid by foot on the frontage to the street. So if they could build up and actually build out to get more floor space on the higher levels, they would. So you can see a lot of them are all higgledy-piggledy here, there, and everywhere. This is where the Dutch gable comes from, even in those days, back in the 1500s, 1600s. That's where they used to put out the block and tackle to pull the furniture up into the windows to get it into the different floors, because they quite often couldn't get it through the front door because it was so narrow down there. Anyway, it's a pretty town. If you ever go to Holland, I recommend going up there to have a look at it. It's phenomenal. An indication of the trade routes by the VOC and the goods they carried. They left Amsterdam, normally taking silver with them, and that they bartered over in Gali and Batavia, or Indonesia now known, for pepper, nutmeg, cinnamon, cloves, cardamom, coffee, because coffee came from Java, sugar came from India, tea from India, and sappan wood. I'm not sure what that is, but those were the spices that were taken back. The little blue lines were the little trading routes for other ships there getting the goods around into these major ports, which were then picked up, taken back, and back up into Europe. When the English got into the trade, and for the tea, that's when we got the tea clippers, like the Cutty Sark and a few others that used to race and get back. Whoever loaded up and got back to England first got the best price for their tea. The ships, does anybody recognize that one? Camel on the back, Cape Town. This is a replica of Jan Riebeck's ship, the Dromedaris, which was in Cape Town Harbour. I don't know when it was taken, but judging by the size of the ladders over the side, it wasn't very big. But that's the sort of ship that they were using in the 1600s and early 1700s. I've got some more ships later. We'll have a look at those. So the VOC used to come down to the Cape of South Africa, stock up supplies in their boats, go on off up to India and Indonesia and Sri Lanka, and then back to Cape Town, get some more supplies for their trip back to Europe. So the VOC decided that they would put up a proper victualling station in Cape Town. And so the trade ships going through there could get their rations from an organized harbour instead of scavenging for their own chandling needs. Jan van Riebeeck, known as the founder of South Africa, was given the task in 1652. He had 17 free burghers, Dutchmen, and their families, who were given land to set up small farms for fruit, grapes, vegetables. Some of the original farms are still in existence and known by their famous winelands, like Constantia, Grooterskuur, Alphen, just to name a few. Alphen Farm was operated by Jacob Kloete, and my wife's paternal great-grandmother was a direct descendant of this Jacob. She married an English soldier, Charles Jackson, and one of their sons, Dirk Kloete van Alphen Jackson, besides being my wife's grandfather, was a member of the first ever Springbok rugby team to tour the United Kingdom in 1906. This is where today gets a little bit tricky in my family, is do I support England where I was born, or do I support South Africa where my wife was born? She's English and she wants, there's a little fun and games we have here, but in some ways we can't lose. No matter which one wins, we can't lose. The farmers recruited slaves from Malaysia to help establish the lands, and with the Khoi, they bartered with the Bushmen for their goats and cattle and so on. So in 1688, there were 230 Huguenots that came into South Africa for asylum. That was from some of the French wars. By 1754, the population had grown to 510 colonists, if you want to call them that, and 6,280 slaves. 50 years later, the population of the Cape had risen to roughly 20,000 of European descent and about 25,000 Malay or coloured slaves. Let's have a look at some of the native tribes. We all know, I think, the San and Bushmen are nomadic hunter-gatherers. Some of this section I'm going to go through quickly because you guys all know this, where the people here in England hadn't a clue. So I'll go through some of these quite quickly. They're the oldest inhabitants and lived there for at least 20,000 years. In looking at the Bushman paintings reminds me of my days in Natal when I used to go climbing in the Berg, and we used quite a few of the caves there as stopovers, and quite a few of them had Bushman paintings, like Giant's Castle, Fergie's Cave, Battle Cave. We've all got nice paintings, Bushman paintings in there. The Khoi tribes, the Nama, Damare, Herero, etc. Dutch called them Hottentots from the sounds they made when talking. I can understand that. They were more pastoral and tended to settle in an area for a long time with their herds. As you can see from the map, they're mostly up the western side of South Africa. And this lot here, nobody knew anything about what was going on there because it hadn't been explored. In the early 1800s, missionaries from the Cape started going north. They found almost nobody but barren lands until about 1818, 1820. Coming up the coast here, they found some of the other tribes, like the Nguni, Xhosa, Tembu, Fingo, Pondos. They were all up the eastern coast of South Africa. Some of them came down from the north, Mozambique, which was the Shona, Matabele, Swazis. They all came from up north. Zulus, to begin with, there weren't any Zulus. Zulu tribe as a nation only existed around about 1815 onwards, and it was formed out of the fighting chiefs of the Ngoni and Shona and the Matabele, and they banded together to go and beat up the next lot, and they became known as the Zulus. They were the ones that decimated the San Bushmen from the central areas and anyone else who came along, effectively leaving the current areas of Free State and Transvaal without any tribes in them at all. So we had these guys from the north all coming down here, causing problems. This is where most of the European descent were at the time. There's very few anywhere else. And because they were coming here, they were pushing the sand and the koi further up this way. And then there was a little bit in the middle when they were all having good scraps. Meanwhile, back in Europe, French and Navy in the Napoleonic Wars of 1793 to 1815. France beat up the Netherlands and made it a little minor country, satellite country, and they annexed Holland as part of France in 1810. 1797, Dutch fleet was defeated by the British in the Battle of Camperdown. I know there's a Camperdown in Natal, but it wasn't there. It was somewhere up in the north in the seas. And as we saw, the VOC came to an end. France considered the Dutch fleet and the large Dutch shipbuilding capacity very important assets. But after the Battle of Trafalgar, which Nelson of English won, they gave up the attempt to match the British fleet, despite a strong Dutch lobby to this effect. That they wanted to keep their building going, but Britain had now taken over most of the Dutch colonies, with the exception of some of the Dutch East Indies, which is Indonesia, Suriname, and the Dutch Antilles. And they also, funny enough, I didn't know, they had a trading post at Toshima in Japan, so they actually got a long way around. Nice picture I found of a sea battle on the go. Here's our good old ships. They get close as they can to each other, blast off their cannons to try and knock holes in the other side, and then try and sail out of it. Now, I don't know how people could sail so many ships in the one small area like this painting was, but I enjoyed it. It's a good picture. Back in the Cape, January 1806 saw the Battle of Blouberg just north of Cape Town, which saw the British take over the admin of the Cape Colony from the Dutch and the French. The Dutch, by then, and British extended their farming areas into the Eastern Cape, mainly for grazing livestock, under a loan place scheme or annual rent. So quite a lot of the Boer farmers moved along the coast and up to what's now Eastern Cape, the Eastern Cape province, for grazing areas. The military, under Colonel Jacob Kaler, established forts and outposts to protect the lands from cattle raiders and the burning of homesteads, because the Xhosa, Zulu, Fingo, all of them were still being pushed southwards. And when they came across these new establishments, no, they wanted the land, they didn't want anybody else there. And that led to the frontier wars that started in 1811. They went on quite a few different battles like that, and the places were set up. In England, the Westminster government was being told that there's going to be problems in the Eastern Cape, and this was as early as 1810. But they ignored that because we've got a British army out there. But when the nonsense in India started and the cavalry was all taken away from South Africa in 1817, they suddenly realized that they're leaving a lot of unprotected lands. So if we look at a map of South Africa as it was in 1817, this is about all of what was known of Southern Africa at the time. Here's Algoa Bay. This, I think, is the Great Fish River. Up here, there was unknown territory. So that was predominantly what South Africa was in 1817. And if we look at a little bit more detailed from the Eastern Cape, we've got Port Elizabeth down the bottom. We know that the Dutch and the Portuguese and so on have been around there 1770. They got as far as Bushman's River in 1775, 1780, the Great Fish River, which became quite a known boundary. Then this was the neutral territory in the middle here. Buffalo's where East London is. And then further up to the Great Kai River. So this is the sort of territory that the settlers were pushed into to start with. So 1818, government considered introducing immigrant settlers along the right bank of the Great Fish River. In other words, from the Fish River down to Port Elizabeth. Lord Bathurst persuaded the government to put up £50,000 to meet the cost of the scheme. Now, in those days, a pound is worth probably about £1,000 in today's money. So that was an awful lot of money that was put up for the scheme. In London, they gave the job to Lieutenant John Bailey to work out how they could get the scheme to work. And 1819, the scheme was advertised for parties to emigrate. Great, they thought. Let's see who we get. They got anything over 50,000 applications in the colonial department, which was just too many. They couldn't handle that. So they had to set up some basic rules. And each party had to have a leader and at least 10 able-bodied working men or families. So that was the start of the rules that they had. They had quite a few other problems, because the Dutch in the Cape were not happy under British rule. They didn't like the idea of losing their monetary unit of the Rijksdollar and changing the pound. They believed they were being ribbed, losing value. If they could get an immigrant scheme into operation, they could buy out those lone place farms that the Dutch had and use that land for the settlers. The settlers would then be expected, amongst other things, to protect their own property. So if you give a man 100 acres and say it's his, he's going to fight to keep that. That was their theory. The area of land that could be bought would determine the number of settlers that they could have on the scheme. So when they started the 50,000 and that was out, they then set out a lot of qualification rules by written application. Now, Sue Mackay, who's on the audience today, was one of the very good people that transcribed all those letters, application letters, and you have them in your eGGSA library. I've also got copies of them on 1820settlers.com. These were the letters that they wrote to Bathurst, Lord Bathurst, to say, I want to go, what do I need to do, and put me up for it. Some of the rules that were given is that deposits were to be paid before leaving. And it worked at £10, which would be roughly £1,000 or 24,000 Rand today, for a single man or family and his wife. Man, wife, 2 children under 14. £10 for each single woman over 18 years of age. So in other words, if you had a big family and you had 2 daughters who were 20 and 21, you would have to pay £10 for each of those women. £5 for a child between 14 and 18, and £2.10 for each child under 4. I've got under 14. Oh, it is under 14. The deposits would be repaid in cash or rations over a 3-year period. So they paid their deposits, hopefully got on a ship, were given a piece of ground. Over 3 years, they would be repaid some of what they had deposited to get them there in either rations or cash. There were a few other things that came in, which some of them caused controversy. The party leader would be given land, a land grant of 100 acres per able-bodied man. Now, early on, they said you had to have a leader and 10 able-bodied men. So all the farms, which should theoretically have been bigger than 1,000 acres. The government would sponsor clergymen and surgeons for large parties of over 100 men. So some of them got out there for free, and they had some help as well. But the 100 acres per able-bodied man caused a bit of a problem, because some of the party leaders claimed the 100 acres per man was given to them, not the people he took out with him. Some of them believed that the 100 acres was theirs and they wanted it, and it caused a few rifts. Some of the parties, if you take those in Clumber, that was divided up into 100 acres for settlers to go on. Some of the others were not divided up at all, and the leader kept that. As it turned out, some of the settlers couldn't work on the farms and left to go, so that the leader of the party actually gained more land than what he thought he was going to get. I don't know, I'm not a farmer, and I wasn't, well, we did have a farm in Kenya, but I doubt whether you could make a living off 100 acres in the Eastern Cape. In fact, I doubt whether you could make a living off 1,000 acres unless it was for sheep and cattle. So a lot of them, of the settlers who weren't farmers by trade, they actually abandoned their lands and went into the cities to carry on their jobs of wheelwrights and wagon makers and butchers and so on and so forth. The other problem that came up was certain party leaders bent the rules about these deposits. And in the early days of me putting together where I found all the settlers and who they were, we came across at least 3 families who were not actually a man, wife, and 2 children, but they were the eldest brother and sister and the youngest 2 children of a family. And they were being redefined as a separate family. So those 4 would go as a separate family, only costing £10, where if the head of the family played it straight, it would have cost him £25. So we suddenly had, when we were looking at where these settlers come from, that no, this was a family and 2 kids. But when you looked at death notices that came up a few years later, they weren't separate families. They were actually the children of one of the other settler leaders. Gave us a few headaches, and some of them took us some time to work out. The aim of the deposit scheme was to get the wealthy families and their servants and labourers to cut out the chances, the out-of-work soldiers and the poor who had applied. Now, that failed in some ways, because a lot of the English churches had a lot of poor, and they thought, well, the church had to look after the poor. If they got rid of their poor people, they wouldn't be paying out the money. And they worked out it would be cheaper for them to get 10 of their poor people at £100. So it's each man at £10 a piece, £100. Pay out the £100 now, ship those 10 chancers or poor people out as settlers, and within a couple of years, with them not having to feed them and house them, they would have recovered their money. So quite a few of those that came out to South Africa were actually not the wealthy. They were, some of them, very poor. Anyway, eventually, about 60 parties were formed with roughly 3,870 questionable in around about 1,200 families, children, single men and women. There were also some independent parties which formed. They couldn't get government sponsorship, and because the government didn't have any more money to help get them out there. So they banded and hired their own ships to sail from England out to South Africa as part of the scheme, but as independents. They were given, some of them were given land, and some of them were actually given the rations when they got to South Africa. So taking those into account, and very little info on them was actually found, it was difficult to work out who the final numbers were. Government hired 17 ships, and they left from Gravesend docks, London, Portsmouth, just down the road from me, Bristol, Liverpool, Cork in Ireland, Greenock, Scotland, all departing somewhere between the 3rd of December 1819 to the 16th of March 1820. Another problem, I just lost my voice for a minute, sorry. Another problem that came up was that having settlers paid and got into parties and get allocated to a ship, how did they know in that party and that ship back in South Africa, how big a piece of ground they needed for those parties coming out. Because if it took 3 months to get the mail out there and 3 months to get the ships out there, and the ships were leaving at the last minute with 480 people, those in South Africa, Jacob Kohler and his crew who were getting the info and allocating the farms, said, oh, the ship coming in, we don't know how many's on it. So it's only when they docked in Port Elizabeth and got off that they actually sort of worked out, okay, this party's got so many, therefore they can go to these sort of places and these farms. So it was a bit tricky. And even then, the lists were not complete. Some of the lands that they had allocated for a party were found far too small for that party, and other pieces of ground far too large. And poor old General Kyler had to make decisions on the spur of the moment when the convoys arrived as to which land they would be allocated. Classic case was Rietfontein and Salem in the Eastern Cape. Some of the Salem settlers were moved and put onto Rietfontein, and then they realized, no, that big Rietfontein was reserved for one of the settlers coming in. So these poor settlers had been there 6 months when they'd already started planting and putting up their houses, and they were told, no, we put you in the wrong place, and they moved them back to Salem. So there's quite a lot of disruption like that. Trying to work out who was who and where they came from was also fun. In 2001, I started compiling a database of all the names, ages, parties, and ships from books and sources in an attempt to try and work out a definitive list of the settlers. And I came up with a list of 3,873 settlers. Corey's count came to 3,487. And it was based on those that the total amount of £14,000 was paid to the government to get them out there. So I went through all these books, Records of the Cape, Sheffield Stories of the Settler, Campbell's British South Africa, Corey's Centenary Souvenir, which had a list of the settlers. A Dispatch Christmas edition had a list of settlers, Hockley's book, Morse Jones's book, even Nash's book, and some of the agents' returns for from Cape Town in the archives. And I've now tried to put it all together into my own book. So there's another reference book out there for people to work out who and where all the settlers came from. Trouble we had in doing this is that from the lists, we found that other people were added. Some were missing and never came. Those died at sea or born at sea were not always accounted for accurately. Names are spelt differently. There are age differences where they'd said that they were 21, meanwhile they were 25 or they were 18. Fictitious families and names. That came about with a couple who were wanting to leave England and leave their old name behind, which had got a bad rep, and start as somebody new in South Africa. So they'd be on the leaving list in their old name, but when they arrived in South Africa, they had a new name, but they were settlers. Some traveled under the names of others who failed to get on their ships. Now, not all the parties listed in all those books, i.e. Nash, for example, didn't include Nightingale's party in her book. Nightingale's party had quite a few people, but they were independents, and most of them ended up in Cape Town. But I don't know why D. Nash didn't include them. So I was finding names in the other books where these Nightingale party people were, but Nash didn't have them in her book. When I put my book together, I tried to double check and double check and double check all the info. But when it went to print, there's one little section where I actually missed out naming the Carlisle party. And I got a very quick email to say I'd forgotten them, so I had to go and modify the production of the books for the next set that went out about a week later. But these things happen. We do make mistakes. Lovely picture, this. Problem the scheme had was that in the winter of December 1819 through to January 1820, the Thames River froze over and the ships were trapped in the ice, and they were there for a couple of weeks. So we'd had settlers already boarded on the ships. They'd gone down the Thames waiting for the right winds to get them out and round past Kent and down, and suddenly they were iced in. And we know of certain families who were on board a ship that, having been on it stuck in ice for a week, it was obviously flipping cold, decided this wasn't for them, and they left. But now the agents got worried because they'd got the money for 200 people and 20 have left. I'm just going to find 20 more people and stick them on board so that the count is right when it gets to South Africa. So trying to work out who actually abandoned ship and who replaced them has been fun. And I'm not sure even today that I know all of the information on that. Now, I don't know how many of you have been to London, but one of the big attractions is Tower Bridge in London, which is quite a nice, big, old, established bridge with a road that opens up. The ship in the middle here is the 780-ton replica of the Swedish Gothenburg, which visited London in 2007. It was originally built in the late 1700s, probably about 1785, so the timing and the shape and size is right. The Weymouth, which was the biggest settler ship, was 826 tons, I think it was, so only a little bit bigger than this one. So that gives an idea that these ships were small, not like what you see now. This little one down the bottom here is an earlier one from about 1700. It's probably about 2/3 of the size of the normal ships that took the settlers out. The old Queen Mary in the background here, which was at one time one of the largest passenger liners, has now been overshadowed by those great big liners that we see coming into the harbours here in Portsmouth and Southampton. This is probably about 3/4 of the size. So the size difference between the ships was phenomenal. Some people got seasick on these boats. Imagine what would happen on a small little boat like that. Hate to admit it, but having a programming background and knowing a little about maps and geography and so on, some of the books that I read on the settlers gave an idea of where and how the ships traveled. And this here is the route taken by the Kennersley Castle, which left Bristol. And most of the ships would have taken the same sort of route. So they came out down past Portugal and Spain. They were stopped off for provisions there, and then they would have had enough to get down and across into the Cape, refueled in Cape or Simonstown, and then round to Port Elizabeth. The Weymouth, being a British, well, finding this info was difficult because most of the ships did not have to keep logs. But the Weymouth, being a military ship owned by the British Navy, HMS Weymouth, Her Majesty's store ship, was about twice as high as the other ships and had 478 settlers on board. May have needed more refreshments, so they left from England out through to Cape Verde, Canary Island area, refilled St. Jago, then came into Annobon Island in the Gulf of Guinea here, then went out towards St. Helena and finally the last little loop in. And that's one of the reasons it took a little bit longer to get there than most of the other ships. These are actually on my website. One of the Dutch ships arriving in Cape Town. It's quite interesting finding all these paintings of the ships. This is a model of the Weymouth. I think it was made by Dr. Pringle, who was obviously from South African settler stock. And I believe it's in the Port Elizabeth Museum. The actual ship was originally built in 1804, and it was called the Indiaman Wellesley. And when it was purchased by the Royal Navy in 1811, they changed it into a store ship and armed it with 11 cannons, 11 guns. After settlers and so on, she was used as a convict ship from about 1828. In other words, they anchored them and used them as housing for convicts. I hate to say it, but the same sort of thing is happening now here in England, where they're putting out barges and old ships as housing for the immigrants and the illegal immigrants that were getting. Weymouth was broken up in about 1860, 1863, somewhere in the Bahamas. She sailed from Portsmouth on the 13th of January and got to Cape Town on the 26th of April. So that's what, 3 months and a week. And finally around to Port Elizabeth, 15th of May, 1820. And she was the largest of the ship. Another picture I have is this one is an engraving of a ship with the name Aurora. The engraving was done in 1826, and it may have been the same Aurora that transported settlers to the Cape. We can think that it was nice it was that, but we can't prove it. It does look big enough to have had 340 odd settlers and children on it. Those are about the only pictures, other than the Chapman picture, that we have of the actual ships, or that I've managed to find of the actual ships. The government hired a whole lot. Aviona, Albury, Aurora, that's 344. The Chapman. These were all the government hired ships. This Aviona left Greenock in Scotland. Unfortunately, she was on her own, left on the 13th of October, 1820. She sailed on her own to the Cape, and round about the 25th of November, somewhere round about crossing the equator, she caught fire. And after 15 hours was totally destroyed. 3 small boatloads of survivors, I think with 52 people, including the captain and 15 of the crew, were saved by a Portuguese merchant ship who was on its way back to Lisbon. 6 of those survivors, the settler survivors, still wanted to go out to South Africa as settlers, and they went out in the following year and arrived in August 1821. So if we add up all these numbers here and what we had known of the independence, we've got just over 4,000 counted numbers, but we know that those are not right because we just haven't found them. I still think there's probably only about 3,800 actually went, and I think I've accounted for 2,930 odd in my database and searches. I'm still getting info with people saying, hey, you haven't got me, here's my family, and you go back and prove it and try and prove it and find out, yes, they were actually settlers. So we're still finding settler families now. I know that there's some others that I haven't got, and I've actually contacted descendants of that family, and they've said, no, I don't want to give you the info. I'm writing a book and I'll put the info in my book. Thank you very much. And they wouldn't part with their information to help build up the actual database of all the 1820 settlers. Their choice. I can't do anything about it. This is a typical scene of what would have been like on board a ship. You've got mothers, children, people playing music. Don't know what this guy's up to. Some young lass being charmed by all the young men. But there were a lot of rules applied on the passengers in the boarding the ships. For example, all persons other than those declared sick must get up by 7 o'clock in the morning. Meals were at defined times, 8 o'clock, 12 noon, and 6 p.m. and would last 1 hour, and after that the decks had to be cleared. Nobody could wash clothes below the decks. They only allowed to wash them on the top deck, like this one, when there was suitable weather. Obviously, no smoking allowed below deck. Yabuena, I think somebody went down into the hold to check something there and knocked over his paraffin lamp or oil lamp that he was carrying, and that's what set the ship on fire. Passengers were responsible for keeping their own areas clean and tidy. Baggage was stored below decks in the hold, and you could only access them at certain times with permission on certain days, and it was lights out by 9 o'clock. Sort of reminds me of my 12 years I spent in boarding school, but there you go, they had it for 3 months. This is the only known picture of the Chapman, and this is actually sailing into the harbour in Malta. But it was the first settler ship to arrive in Algoa Bay. So it's got a little bit of fame. Arrived on the 10th of April. There were quite a few deaths on various ships due to illnesses like measles, chickenpox, etc. Some births compounded the numbers because they didn't register them when they got on land. So a baby came into South Africa with no name and was not on any list. The numbers got very difficult. The master of the Chapman, John Milbank, he married Sarah Elizabeth Reed, who was one of the settlers' daughters when they got to Cape Town. So even though I've seen people claiming that my ancestor was the first on South African soil, I think that the Reed family would have been the first off the Chapman onto Cape Town soil for the wedding and marriage of their daughter and then back on the ship. Quite a few of the ships, and I know the Weymouth was one, stopped in Simonstown, and the party leaders got off the ship in Simonstown to go and talk to Somerset, who was the overriding boss of the British in South Africa at the time. We don't know how many got off and went to see him, but it goes back, and some people are saying no, they're only the first settlers, and when they got onto the beach soil in Port Elizabeth, they were the first ones. So there's always going to be a controversy as to who was the first settler to set foot on South Africa. Very difficult. Apologies for the quality of this map, but this is what was known as South Africa in 1819. We got Cape Town, Simonstown, Algoa Bay, Great Fish River boundary, and so on. There's not an awful lot there. Bushmen up here, Bushmen here, Pondos, Xhosas, Tembus. This neutral territory is what the British outlined and said to all the indigenous breeds, for another word, that don't come across this lot and across the Kai, because you'll get shot at and whatever. And the British had a lot of problems trying to establish that this was a free boundary and you couldn't get through it. It was no man's land. What the British didn't understand is that the Xhosas used to go into a little place called Clay Pits, just outside Grahamstown, to get the clay for their traditional initiation ceremonies, because there's nice white clay there. So there's always going to be traffic over this neutral territory, and a lot of that was what the cause of the frontier wars was about. The Brits had some ideas, and the Xhosas and Tembos had a different idea of what was meant by having this free territory. Getting the settlers off the ships and onto land was quite a challenge. There was a small settlement in Algoa Bay. This painting doesn't really show much of the settlement, a little bit there, I suppose. Tent town. and it was named Port Elizabeth after Sir Ruthven Donkin, who was the, quote, governor of the Cape at the time. And his wife was Elizabeth. So it became Port Elizabeth. And I think the Donkin Memorial is still called that on top of the hill in PE. There were no jetties or docks for the ships to come up against. They anchored in the bay. And these, well, I'd like to call them lighters because I think that was the name of them, were hauled from the shore to the ship and back with passengers and goods. And the two outriggers were there to stop this tipping over. And if you notice, there's a rope here that comes up through a notch. This guy here is pulling on it, and the rope goes through, and then out the other side, you can see it going down there. That all went all the way through to the land. So they pulled the boats loads of people and all the furniture from the ships to the land. Quite a clever exodus. Even here, you can see the ropes going through that they're pulling on. And that's how they got the people off the settler ships and onto land. And all their furniture and luggage and goods and chattels. This dresser survived 4 months at sea on board one of the ships, and it was offloaded on one of those ships to the beach, put onto an ox wagon and taken and up over hills and down through valleys and dongas and all the rest of it to wherever the settler stopped. It's currently in the Albany Museum in Grahamstown, and apparently it weighs a phenomenal amount because that's very hard wood. And I think it might have actually been in 2 pieces with a top and a bottom, but I don't remember. I know I took this picture in the Albany, but I didn't really at the time look to see if it came apart. But that I would have hated to have got off a ship and on the sea. When they got onto the land, they were all housed in tents by the party. So there would be a bunch of tents set up for the party and the people and all their stuff. The Boers and their wagon leaders arrived with the wagons, and they picked up all the people and their goods and pieces and the tents and took them with them when they went inland. You can see on the ground here there is their chopping boxes. There's a plough here, case of something there. So everything was taken with them. A lot of them brought their actual carriages, hoping that a horse could travel around on the roads. Well, they didn't realize that there weren't any roads then. So a lot of fun. Here's another lot. You can see the couple of established houses, huts, but they're all getting ready in their ox cart sessions to go out and up to where they were finally dropped off in the Eastern Cape. Somebody said that there wasn't a painting of most of the ships or a lot of ships in Port Elizabeth at the time. Then I found this one, and there's what, 5, 6, 7 there. I don't think there was ever 7 there at the same time that were settler related, but 3 or 4 of them might have been settler ships and others just normal trading vessels. At one stage, the British government decided that the settlers would pay for their transport from here to their farms. And then they realized that the way it was going to work, there was no way that those settlers coming out to a country, they wouldn't have brought that amount of money or whatever with them. So they let the settlers off the transport charges and the hire of the Boers and their cattle. And it eventually cost the British over £300,000 instead of the £50,000 that they had budgeted in Parliament. I saw, I think it's in Records of the Cape, there's an accounting of the charge from the Navy to the British government for about £89,000 for the hire of their naval ships and the stores and the sailors. So it cost a lot to do it. Anyway, they got into Algoa Bay most of them. Some of them went up to Clan William. Some of them stayed near Simonstown, but most of them came through here, came through Algoa Bay. They would have gone from the beach up through to Addo Drift, and then from there split, either to go up through Rautenbach's Drift and Assegai Bosch through Grahamstown to the farms at the top part, or on the lower route down through Jager's Drift past Theopolis to Bathurst, then up to I forgot the name of the hill where the toposcope is. Bailey and Kayla said, right, this is where we are, and this is where your farm is going to be. And that's the toposcope if you've seen pictures of it. We went back to South Africa. Well, let me say, taking this trip through here to get to Grahamstown would have taken about 10 days by ox cart. They would have traveled probably 6 hours a day, 2 hours to find somewhere to outspan, and then 2 hours the next morning to load the wagons up and get ready to go again. So they only traveled for about 6 hours a day. In 2014, Janet and I flew to PE. We hired a car. We drove up to Grahamstown, and I think we were there in about an hour, hour and a half at most. So the difference is phenomenal. You basically would walk that in 10 days because that's what they did. Some of the terrain they had to cross was quite rough and hilly. This typical river drift crossing. If there have been heavy rains, like we've been having here in Scotland, and I know you guys have had down in the Cape, these would have been completely underwater and it would have been impassable. And they just have to wait for the waters to go down before they could cross. On that flight to PE from Durban, I took this and the next picture out the window. This is Kenton-on-Sea down here. Lombard's Post, Theopolis is about here somewhere. But this was to give an idea of how little of the land is actually being cleared for grazing and farming. And the rest of it is very hilly up and down. And the ox wagons would have had to navigate these rivers, get up and down them on going to get their farms. This is looking out, that's Port Alfred. This is Bathurst. Bunkers Hill is the name I was looking for. Bunkers Hill is about here, where the toposcope is. And that they tried to work out and said, right, your farm's going to be that piece over there. Your farm's going to be that piece. Your farm's going to be this piece. You're going to go over here. And they directed everybody from that Bunkers Hill. This was a map drawn up by, I can't think of his, Knoble, of where the proposed allocated farms would be. I used this and quite a few other maps that I got hold of to work out where all the farm settlers, the farms where the settlers were put. And I think a lot of people have seen this or have got this picture. So I'm going to skip that for a bit. We'll get onto that later. When the settler parties were dumped on their allocated lands, this is probably what their situation looked like. They would have, this painting by Irons represents a hunting or fishing picnic, supposedly of the Bowker family from some reports, but it shows a covered wagon, which they would have brought all the family and their bits and pieces with, a bell tent, they might have had one or two, and their casks and what have you with their rations. And this is how they would have started life when they were left on their own, living in a tent. Some of them stayed in the tents for up to 3 years before they either had to move out because they deteriorated and leaked, or they'd managed to build themselves some sort of shelter. Some of the very early shelters were like this one, obviously copied from the bell tent and from what the local tribes had used. And they started like that. This was a settler house and barn put together at some stage. Thomas Phillips's house sketch of it on Glendower, which was just south of Port Alfred. And eventually they got round to doing reasonably decent houses, villages. This is the original farmhouse built in about 1824 on the farm Rietfontein, from a photo taken about 1880. Nice fences. And this is the same farmhouse taken 30 years later in 2014. The original buildings are still there. This one and that one, tree next to it. Tree's gone, but the houses are still there. This is an engraving of Christopher Thornhill's house. This one here. His son-in-law built a house on top of the hill. That was William Gilfillan. Volkswagen. Lombard's Post. I hope this has been restored. And I think there were moves to get it restored, and I would like to see it restored. But look at the cracks that happened in the buildings. That is after time. But the other interesting thing is the very narrow slit windows on the bottoms of the houses. And they were there so that they could poke their rifles through as a protection against the marauding Xhosas, Tembus, Fingos, whoever. More difficult to throw an assegai through a little slit like that than have a big window which they could actually get through. This is the church in Port Alfred. It was built in 1822. I believe it's still there and it's still operational, but it was used in bad times for a school, as a refuge place, and as the church. The bell off a ship or somewhere was to call people to school, or even on farms they used bells like that to wake up the workers or tell them it was time to knock off for lunchtime or whatever. But interesting finding some of these old pictures. This is a painting I found of the start of Bathurst. That on the top of the hill there is St. John's Church in Bathurst. Now that was started, I think, in 1831 or 32, and it took them about 7 or 8 years to complete it, due to interruptions by the frontier wars. Bathurst was originally set up as it was central to most of the settlers, as the rations depot. So they would all go to Bathurst to pick up their rations that they needed. And it was also judicial. But there was a bit of an argument between the two British people in charge, one in Bathurst and one in Grahamstown. And Grahamstown won, and the judicial and main ration depot was moved to Grahamstown. Rations. This is scary. Part of the deal was that they would receive rations for the first 3 years. They would get mealie meal, 3/4 of a pound per man per day. Now, a pound is 454 grams, so that's probably about 300 grams of flour, as it was, per person per day. 2 pounds, a kilo of meat per person per day. Women got half of that, and a child got 1/3 of that. So they had to work out how much they were supposed to get for each family and for how many days. And then it was up to them as to what they did with that. Now, okay, I make bread. I've got a machine as a bread maker. I put in 300 grams of white flour and 300 grams of brown flour in it, chuck in some water and some yeast, a little bit of butter, stick it in the bread machine, and it makes me a loaf of bread. So looking at the rations to make 1 loaf of bread, you took up pretty much a whole day's worth of one person's mealie meal. So it wasn't easy. On one of the books by Guy Butler, he quotes Jeremiah Goldswain. Dear reader, I ought to inform you that as soon as we came on shore, the government gave us rations. Well, I do not know what we should have done, for I am sure that our master could not have found us food. The government gave every man 3/4 pound of meal and 2 pounds of meat per day. The women got half of it, and the child 1/3 of it. This was insufficient for us to live on. And somewhere else I read that they went to Grahamstown to collect 6 pounds of flour for 3 days for 6 men. And that's less than what that there said. So it was not easy. They were also supplied with seed, wheat, oats, corn, carrots, potato seed, and so on, to start their own little farms. But it was an absolute failure because a lot of the ground that they were given was only good for grazing, and you couldn't hope to grow massive crops there. Where they could plant, the wheat developed rust, and the rains in some cases washed the whole crop and their houses, everything they had, downstream to the sea. Quite a few settlers were ruined in the first 2 years, and they gave up any thought of staying on the land, and they went to town for work. So, yeah, that happens. If you think about it now in Port Alfred area, Bathurst area, okay, they grow pineapples. There's a lot of grazing area, but a lot of the farmlands are now being turned into game farms. And even big games like at Addo Elephant Park and so on, which is famous. In 2014, when we were driving around through Salem and down to Kenton and taking some of the shortcuts through, we saw giraffe, eland, waterbuck, and impala from the car without actually going into any farm. It's just straight from the road. Grahamstown, as it was in 1823, sorry. I don't know Grahamstown well enough to know which direction this is looking, whether this is the road to the Port Alfred and that's the road to Bathurst, or whether these go inland, I'm not sure. Only thing I did notice is got a nice big wide street, and I think that same main street in Grahamstown is still very wide. It was built that wide so that they could actually turn the oxen and the carts around in it to go back again. Where did the parties come from? Quite a lot of the counties in England. I've got a map of them in my book, but not here. Pigots were from Berkshire, Howard, Buckinghamshire, some from Cornwall, Devon, Exon, Hampshire, Lancashire, up north, Norfolk, Nottinghamshire, Oxford. Bowker was put down as from Wiltshire. Well, he was living in Wiltshire at the time, but the Bowkers originally came from Northumberland. London areas, there were a lot there, but they were not all actually born from London or that area, Middlesex. Parties were made up there, and people joined from Kent and Essex and Buckinghamshire, Surrey, all joined in what we call the London areas. I've got complete lists of this on the website, which we can look at later. Scotland, we had Campbell's, Russell's party. That was the one that on the Abiona, which caught light, and Pringle. Campbell was given area, what is now known as Rietfontein, near the south of Port Alfred. Pringle's and Scottish party ended up in Pavianskloof. Welsh was Griffiths and Phillips from there. Ireland, the Irish parties, they all ended up at Clanwilliam. Some again objected like nobody's business because you could not plough the land that they were given. And I think Scanlon and some of Parker's persuaded the government to pick them up from Clan William, and they got farms in Albany. Sinnott, I think, stayed there. Ingram, I think, stayed in Clan William. He went back to Ireland to get a second lot of people out. He must have found something of use there. This is an interesting little map I found, and it actually answered a couple of questions that I'd always had. When I was finding these families and finding death notices and birth records and baptisms, and they were saying, where do they come from? Where were they born? Aidenhoek. Well, I know of a town called Aidenhoek. Blimey, there was a lot from there. And Somerset, town of Somerset. Craddock, town of Somerset, of Craddock. But when you see this map, it was that demographic area was called Aidenhoek. So they were born somewhere in this area, but not known where. Somerset, somewhere in this area. So I had to change the thought of how do I find out exactly where they ended up. This has also got tacked onto it, the dark green bits where the settlers were dumped, as it were. Again, the Fish River as a boundary, the buffer zone called Victoria, and then, nice term, Queen Adelaide's province going up through East London and so on. They've all changed. It's all now just Eastern Cape. Just a sidetrack. The Eastern Cape province, as it is now, is roughly 169,000 square kilometers. It's roughly the size of the country of Uruguay. It's the second biggest in the Northern Cape and has nearly 14% of South Africa's total land area. In 2010, which was the last census figures I saw, Eastern Cape had roughly 6.5 million. Now, if you take England and Wales, England is 130,000 square kilometers. Wales is 20,000, so that's 150,000 square kilometers. In other words, England and Wales will fit into the Eastern Cape. In 2010, England and Wales had a population of about 65 million. Again, 6.5 million, so 10 times more people in the same area. In 1840, the total population of South Africa was estimated at 1.9 million, while England and Wales' 1841 census had a population as 15.9 million. I digress a little bit, but it was very interesting. I get lots of queries that, how can I find where so-and-so lived, and could I go and have a look at it? Well, you go to any one small town and you find a nice name like Williams, then you might find 4 Williams families living there. And guess what? Most of those Williams families had the name Thomas somewhere in it. So which Thomas Williams from that town are you looking for? Very, very difficult here to actually work out where they come from. And I'm struggling a bit in my own family like that. By 1885, South Africa had grown a lot more. Cape Colony was all this piece down the bottom here. This is all the Cape Colony. Lesotho, Free State, South African Republic or Transvaal, Swaziland, Zululand, a little bit of Natal. Up here we had Great Namakwa, which is now obviously Namibia, and Matabeleland, now the Zimbabwe, and British Protectorate of Bechuanaland, which is now Botswana. I think this boundary has changed a bit across the top. The first Anglo-Boer War was over getting these 2 provinces, and including the second one, the British wanting to take over these 2 provinces as to create one big South Africa. That was 1885. Well, 1820 settlers survived. My estimate is that from original 12,000 families, they've produced in the 7 or 8 generations close on 500,000 descendants, many of whom are now spread all over the world. They've produced presidents, governors, farmers, engineers, botanists, doctors, you name it, and many more types of people who built South Africa and the neighboring countries. This statue is by Mitford Barberton and is at the Settler Monument in Grahamstown. And I used it as the picture on the front of my book, which, if I can get a little bit of advertising in, it's still available on Amazon if you want it. And most of the info I have sitting on my website, and we can have a look at that just now, if we like. Unfortunately, well, I've had a lot of help and a lot of information supplied by an awful lot of people and some very well-known South African genealogists who have now departed. And I've got references to what they gave from Joan Lovemore Hope, Peter Kirkman, Peter van Aert, Tessa King, Lynn MacLeod, Dave Glenister, a few others are all since gone. They all helped me quite a lot in building up the information in the 1820 settlers. So that's the end of my 68 slides. And I'm going to say thank you. Thank you for your time.
Okay. Hi, Paul. That was really, really interesting. Thank you very much. My name is Margaret Elfrink. I was Margaret Pringle. And you mentioned my father in the course of your talk as the guy who made that beautiful model of the ship, the Weymouth. This is now in the Port Elizabeth Museum. So my dad was a very enthusiastic and quite knowledgeable historian, although his profession was biology. And he did a lot of research, mainly on his family's history, not so much the full 1820 settler history that you did. I don't know if you're aware of the book that he wrote. Let me get it right.
The Pringles
of the Valleys. Do you know the book?
I have a copy, yes.
Oh, you have? That's good, because I was scared you'd ask me to lend you my copy. And
no. I stacked up with the books before I left South Africa, and I've got 2 meters worth of books on the bookshelves behind me, which is nearly all settler info.
Yes, yeah. Another one he wrote that you may be aware of is this one, Sales and Tales.
I haven't got that, but I think I've seen it.
Yes, and he researched it with somebody called Sidney Hudson Reed, and it's quite a different little book, stories of all these ships and the families that came on them and so on. So anyway, I just thought I'd mention these two. I wasn't sure that you had them or not, but my Pringle family has spread out as most of the families have, and it's very interesting. It was once again very interesting, and thank you for your talk.
I want to just maybe share and ask a question as well. Is that there's a Ernest Tucker. I don't know if he's on the list of the 1820 settlers that came to South Africa and married to Johanna. And 3 months ago, one of the great-grandchildren contacted me to say, hey, I'm a Tucker, and we are family. This, the big divide between the white and the brown and the black people is a big thing that's bothering me. I cannot knock down the walls of people that came from England, that came from Scotland, that came from France, that came from Germany, as to somehow match up with my blood. I cannot find them. And so it is extremely difficult. And to do that. But I was also very happy that another cousin, also of the Tucker, that came from this Ernest, that said, oh, he wants to meet up with me. And so we're making this circle go wider, because Tucker's wife was my Aunt Johanna. And she, was born in Peniel. And she went to Cape Town and she married this English man. So the documentation of this family it was very difficult to get them together. And yes, indeed, they are spread all over the world. Yeah. And the excuse, and maybe not the excuse, I would say the dilemma that these family members have is that they didn't know that we were family until a very thin little stream came back to me to say, are you the one doing the research on the sisters? I said, yes. And so, yes, if my profile picture is up, I'm not white. So how is it that we are related? And so I give them that whole thing that I put up of, how part of my family became white. And so we were then estranged from each other. And that is why after so many generations, we meet up again. So I call it hedging. I don't know if that is the right term. I call it in Afrikaans, verskansing, is that somehow I cannot find my family, even the farmers that came from the United Kingdom, George Farmer. I follow him from my family right up, and then it blocks me. I can't get him across the pond. I cannot find him in England. It says, yes, he's English, but I cannot find him in England. So, yes, I just wanted to share that part. But thank you so much for the session, and good luck to all.
I found the slide in the presentation regarding the rations interesting, and that's one of the slides I will probably go back on, because in some of the research I do, well, only for myself, but other people, it's interesting to, I think it would be interesting to compare those rations with the rations for a third-class passenger coming out in the 1900s. Because on the back of the tickets, the rations are printed. That would be an interesting comparison, just as a comment.
Yeah.
The question I asked in the chat was, other than the rations, how much was the average settler, and I don't want to go into the meaning of the word average, allowed to bring? Could they bring, the average person, whether or not they had it or not, carts and spades and shovels and picks and lamps and furniture? Or was there a limit, as in like getting on a plane, 23 kgs?
I don't really know that there was a fixed limit. Some of the wealthy party leaders brought out their furniture. One of them, I think it was Pigott, brought out a cart to go so that he could get from his farm to the nearest town by horse and cart. There were tools like axes, plows, and so on. Quite a lot of them were brought out, the small portable things. I don't think anybody brought anything big like a wagon, but it was mainly their sort of own household effects, their items of cherished value, and what they thought they would need. Now, part of the monies that they had, they spent when they arrived in Algoa Bay or Port Elizabeth on buying the bits and pieces, the spades, the saws, the axes, the hammers, the nails that they thought they would need when they got to their new ground. So they didn't bring them with them, but they were there available. Now, finance monies, the ratios, you probably found they were only paying a penny or two for a hammer in what we would now probably pay 10, 15 Rand for. So it was cheap for them to buy the bits that they needed. And I think quite a lot of them were given a lot by the government at the time to help them get started. But I've known of a horse cart, obviously big tables, Welsh dressers, those sort of things came out, is whatever they could store. But I don't know that there was a limit of what they could take. One of the families, I think it was Greatheads from Bristol, when they went out, when they landed at Port Elizabeth, they found that none of their furniture or goods had been put on the ship. They were still on the dock in Bristol. So William, I think it was, went back to Bristol to find this lot, and sure enough, all their goods were still sitting in the warehouse in Bristol. So now he tried to organize to get them to load it onto a ship to go out, and the government said, sorry, it missed the boat. You'd have to pay for it yourself now. So he, in fact, didn't get back on a free ticket, and he never went back to South Africa. So his family were there without their goods. He had all their goods in England, and they couldn't get from one to the other. There's some tough things that have happened, but I don't know that there was a limit. And you think also that of the provisions that the ships had to have is they had to, down in the hold, have live cattle, live sheep, chickens to be able to feed the people on the way. So there's that side of it which we don't normally think about, but are there.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this morning. This was a nice long session, eh? 2 hours. Well, also from us, a very big thank you. I think it was very informative. I enjoy it.